On April 15, 1944, a 22-year-old pilot named William Uricchio lifted off from an airfield in Assam, India. His cargo hold was packed with rifle ammunition bound for China. His fuel tanks were full. His weather briefing said conditions were acceptable. 3 hours later, his C-46 Commando vanished somewhere over the eastern Himalayas. There was no distress call, no signal, no wreckage spotted from the air. William Uricchio and his crew simply ceased to exist. Search aircraft flew the route for 6 days. They found nothing but clouds, peaks, and jungle so dense that a plane could crash 100 feet from a trail and never be seen again. Uricchio's family received a telegram, missing in action, presumed dead, no remains recovered. They waited for 68 years. In 2012, a recovery team from the Defense POW/MIA accounting agency found fragments of a C-46 in the mountains of northern Burma. DNA testing confirmed the remains. William Uricchio was finally coming home. He was one of more than 1,000 aircraft that disappeared on a supply route the pilots called the Hump. Between 1942 and 1945, American airmen flew 650,000 tons of cargo over the most dangerous air corridor in human history. They crossed the Himalayas, the highest mountains on Earth, in underpowered cargo planes with primitive instruments, through monsoons that could tear wings from fuselages and ice storms that could freeze engines solid. More men died flying supplies over the Hump than died in many combat operations, and when the war ended, America forgot them. The pilots had a name for themselves. They called themselves the Forgotten Bastards of India. This is why. To understand why young Americans flew suicidal cargo routes over the Himalayas, you have to understand what happened in Burma in the spring of 1942. Before the war, there was only one way to get supplies into China: the Burma Road. It was a 700-mile highway carved through some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet. It started at the port of Rangoon, climbed through the jungles of Burma, crossed mountain passes at 10,000 feet, and ended at Kunming in the southwestern China. The road had been built by 200,000 Chinese laborers, many of them working with nothing but hand tools. It was narrow, treacherous, prone to landslides, and often impassable during monsoon season. But it worked. Trucks carried weapons, fuel, and medicine to Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist army, keeping China in the war against Japan. Then in January 1942, the Japanese invaded Burma. Within 4 months, they had captured the entire country. Rangoon fell in March. The Burma Road was cut in April. By May, British and Chinese forces were in full retreat, stumbling through jungle and mountains toward India, with Japanese units close behind. China was now isolated, completely cut off from the outside world. This was not a minor inconvenience. This was a strategic catastrophe. China was tying down over 1 million Japanese soldiers, 1 million troops that could otherwise be redeployed to the Pacific Islands, to Australia, to India. Now, if China collapsed, if Chiang Kai-shek's government surrendered or simply ran out of ammunition, those million soldiers would be free to fight Americans elsewhere. General Joseph Stilwell, the senior American commander in the China-Burma-India theater, understood the stakes. So did President Roosevelt. China had to be supplied. There was simply no alternative, but how? The Japanese Navy controlled the sea approaches. Japanese forces held Burma and blocked any overland route. The only direction left was up. If supplies couldn't go around the Himalayas, they would have to go over them. The India-China airlift, officially designated the India-China Ferry, began in April 1942. Within weeks, pilots were calling it something else. They called it the Hump. The name was deceptively simple. The Hump suggested a minor obstacle, a speed bump on the way to Kunming. In reality, it was 500 miles of the most hostile terrain on Earth. The route began at a cluster of airfields in the Assam Valley of northeastern India. The planes would take off, climb to altitude, and cross the Patkai Range, mountains reaching up to 10,000 feet. Then they would enter the Irrawaddy Valley of Burma, where Japanese fighters sometimes patrolled. If they survived that, they faced the final barrier, the Sansung Range, with peaks exceeding 15,000 feet. On the other side lay Kunming, China. Safety, if you made it. The direct route was 500 miles. Many pilots flew longer, higher routes to avoid Japanese interceptors or the worst weather. Some flights covered 700 miles or more, and they flew this route not once, not as a special mission, but every single day, multiple times per day, day after day, week after week, for 3.5 years. No combat mission in World War II demanded this kind of sustained, grinding exposure to danger. Bomber crews flew a set number of missions, 25, then 30, and went home. Hump pilots had no such limit. They flew until the war ended, until they were killed, or until they were too broken to continue. Act 2 Header. Transitional Image. The planes assigned to the Hump were not designed for what they were asked to do. The primary aircraft in the early months was the C-47 Skytrain, the military version of the Douglas DC-3 airliner. The C-47 was a workhorse, reliable, relatively easy to fly, and forgiving of pilot error. It had proven itself in every theater of the war. But it had a problem. Its service ceiling, the maximum altitude it could sustain, was approximately 24,000 feet. That sounds high enough to clear any mountain. In practice, it was barely adequate. A fully loaded C-47 could not reach its service ceiling. With a cargo hold packed with ammunition, fuel drums, or vehicle parts, the plane struggled to climb above 15,000 feet. Some loads pushed that down to 12,000. The mountains didn't care what altitude your plane was rated for. The peaks stood where they stood. If you couldn't fly over them, you flew through the passes, and the passes were narrow, twisting corridors walled in by rock, often filled with clouds that could hide a mountainside until you were 100 feet from impact. In 1943, the Army Air Forces began introducing the C-46 Commando, a larger aircraft designed specifically for heavy cargo. The C-46 could carry twice the payload of a C-47 and had a higher service ceiling. On paper, it was the solution to the Hump's problems. In practice, it introduced new ones. The C-46 was rushed into service before its design flaws could be corrected. Its fuel system leaked. Its cargo doors sometimes popped open in flight. Its electrical system was unreliable. In cold weather, and it was always cold at altitude over the Himalayas, the C-46's fuel lines had a tendency to ice over, causing engines to sputter and die without warning. Pilots called it the flying coffin, between mechanical failures and the inherent dangers of the route. The C-46 suffered a loss rate that would have been unacceptable in any other context. But there was no other context. There was only the Hump, and the C-46 was what they had. The men who flew these planes were, in many cases, barely old enough to vote. The demands of the Hump exceeded the supply of experienced pilots. The Army Air Forces began feeding the route with fresh graduates from a flight school, young men with a few hundred hours of training, minimal instrument experience, and no exposure to high-altitude mountain flying. They learned on the job. Those who survived their first dozen crossings began to understand the Hump's peculiar dangers. Those who didn't understand quickly enough became statistics. The training pipeline never caught up with the losses. Throughout 1943 and 1944, new pilots arrived at the ASAM bases with the ink still drying on their wings. They were given a brief orientation, assigned to a crew, and sent over the mountains. Many of them made it. Many of them didn't. Lieutenant Clayton Cools, who flew the Hump in 1944, later described the culture of the India-China wing. You knew what you were getting into. You saw the empty bunks. You heard the stories. But you also knew it had to be done, so you did it. You got in your plane, you flew the route, and you tried not to think about whether you'd make it back. The psychological toll was immense. Unlike combat, where fear came in bursts and was followed by periods of relative safety, the Hump offered no relief. Every mission was dangerous. Every takeoff could be your last. The stress was constant, grinding, inescapable. Some pilots cracked. They would refuse to fly or freeze at the controls or simply break down. The military's response was generally to transfer them out of the theater. There was no stigma attached to washing out of the Hump. Everyone understood what it did to men. Those who stayed developed a dark, self-deprecating humor as a coping mechanism. They gave themselves a nickname that captured both their pride and their bitterness: the Forgotten Bastards of India. They weren't forgotten by the Japanese, who occasionally sent fighters to patrol the Burma stretch of the route. They weren't forgotten by the mountains, which were always there, always waiting. They were forgotten by everyone else, by the newspapers that wrote about European invasions and Pacific island hopping, by the public that couldn't find Assam on a map, by a military bureaucracy that saw them as truck drivers, not warriors. They flew anyway, day after day, because someone had to. The Himalayas did not try to kill the pilots of the Hump. The mountains were simply there, indifferent and enormous, and the planes flew through them anyway. The killing was a byproduct of geography. The first danger was altitude itself. At 15,000 feet, the air contains roughly half the oxygen found at sea level. Without supplemental oxygen, pilots and crew would experience hypoxia, a gradual dimming of mental function that often went unnoticed until it was too late. Men would become confused, euphoric, convinced that everything was fine even as their hands stopped responding to their brain's commands. Most Hump aircraft were not pressurized. Oxygen masks were available, but uncomfortable and prone to malfunction. Pilots often flew for hours in conditions that slowly degraded their ability to fly at all. The second danger was weather. The Himalayas create their own climate. Monsoon winds from the Indian Ocean slam into the mountain wall and rise, cooling rapidly, generating clouds, rain, and turbulence of terrifying intensity. During monsoon season, roughly June through September, the Hump route was pounded by storms that modern aircraft would refuse to fly through. The cargo planes had no choice. The supplies had to get through, so they flew into the weather. Pilots described turbulence that threw unsecured cargo against the ceiling, hail that cracked windscreens and dented wing surfaces, downdrafts that could drop a plane thousands of feet in seconds, faster than any pilot could react, updrafts that could push an aircraft into the death zone above 25,000 feet, where engines starved for oxygen and ice formed on every surface. And then there was the ice. Icing was the great, invisible killer of the Hump. When an aircraft flew through clouds at high altitude, moisture would freeze instantly on the wings, the propellers, the control surfaces. A thin layer of ice changed the aerodynamic profile of the wing, reducing lift and increasing drag. A thick layer could make flight impossible. The C-46 was particularly vulnerable. Ice would form on the engine intakes, starving the motors of air. It would jam control cables. It would freeze pitot tubes, making the airspeed indicator useless. A plane could go from fully functional to falling out of the sky in minutes. De-icing equipment existed, but was often inadequate or broken. Pilots learned to read the clouds to avoid the formations most likely to produce severe icing. But sometimes the only way forward was through, and sometimes through was the last route a crew ever flew. The third danger was what waited below. The jungle beneath the hump was among the most inhospitable on Earth. If a plane went down and the crew survived the crash, they faced a secondary battle for survival that many lost. The jungle was thick enough that rescue aircraft flying directly overhead could not see wreckage on the ground. Search parties sometimes passed within a few hundred yards of crash sites without finding them. Men who survived impact could die of exposure, starvation, or disease before help arrived. The wildlife was equally unforgiving. Tigers, leopards, venomous snakes, and clouds of mosquitoes carrying malaria and dengue fever. Some crews who bailed out successfully and landed without injury were never seen again, swallowed by the jungle as completely as if the earth had opened beneath them. The mountain between India and China became known by another name among the pilots, the Aluminum Trail. On clear days, flying the route, you could see the wreckage, glinting fragments of aircraft scattered across ridges and valley floors, engine cowlings, wing sections, fuselages broken open like eggs. The debris formed an almost continuous path, marking every mile of the route with the remains of someone's last flight. Veteran pilots used the wreckage for navigation. They knew specific crash sites and used them as waypoints. That's how common the losses were. The dead had become landmarks. One pilot recalled seeing a C-46 impact a ridgeline directly ahead of him. The plane had been in visual contact flying the same route when it suddenly banked into the mountain. There was no distress call, no warning. The aircraft simply ceased to fly and began to fall. The pilot behind watched the fireball bloom against the rock and then kept flying because there was nothing else to do. Between April 1942 and November 1945, the Hump airlift delivered 650,000 tons of cargo to China. Read that number again. 650,000 tons. It was, by far, the largest airlift in history up to that point. It would not be surpassed until the Berlin airlift of 1948 to 1949, and even that operation moved cargo over a distance measured in hundreds of miles, not 500 miles of mountain and jungle. The Hump kept China in the war. The ammunition, fuel, and equipment that crossed the Himalayas supplied Chiang Kai-shek's forces and, increasingly, the American air units operating from Chinese bases. B-29 superfortresses that bombed the Japanese home islands flew from bases in China. The fuel that powered them had been carried drum by drum over the mountains. The strategic impact was incalculable. 1 million Japanese troops remained tied down in China, fighting a war that American logistics made possible. Those troops never reinforced the Pacific Islands. They never invaded India. They never threatened Australia. The Hump was a slow-motion victory, invisible to the public but essential to the outcome of the war. The cost was measured in aircraft and men. Official figures list approximately 590 aircraft lost over the Hump. Unofficial estimates run much higher. Some historians believe the true number exceeds 1,000, with many crashes simply never reported or attributed to other causes. The mountains were littered with wreckage that no one ever cataloged. More than 1,600 crew members were killed or went missing. Again, the true number is likely higher. In the chaos of the air operations, with crews rotating constantly and records imperfectly kept, Some losses were simply absorbed into the bureaucratic machinery and forgotten. The loss rate was staggering. At the peak of operations in 1944 and 1945, when the most experienced pilots were flying the most reliable aircraft, the Hump was still killing planes at a rate that would have been considered catastrophic in any other context. In the early months, when inexperienced crews flew the C-47s and the first problematic C-46s, the casualties were simply horrific. And when the war ended, the world forgot. There was no Hump Memorial in Washington. No movies were made about the rout. No best-selling books chronicled the sacrifices of the India-China wing. The pilots who survived went home, raised families, took jobs, and found that almost no one knew what they had done or where they had been. The China-Burma-India theater was always the stepchild of the American war effort. It received the lowest priority for aircraft, equipment, and personnel. It was commanded by officers who feuded constantly with each other and with the British. It was fought in jungles that American newspapers couldn't locate, and for strategic objectives that American readers didn't understand. The Hump was the stepchild of the stepchild. Even within the forgotten theater, the pilots who flew cargo were invisible. They weren't fighter aces with kill counts. They weren't bomber crews hitting factories and cities. They were truck drivers of the sky, hauling freight that someone else would use to fight the war. The forgotten bastards of India. They gave themselves that name because they understood their place in the hierarchy of glory. Dead last. Decades passed. The veterans aged. Many died without ever speaking publicly about what they had experienced. The mountains kept their secrets. Then, slowly, the recovery began. Starting in the 1990s, the Defense POW/MIA accounting agency began systematic efforts to locate crash sites along the Hump route. Teams traveled to Burma, now Myanmar, and to the remotest corners of the Himalayas. They used satellite imagery, local guides, and testimony from villagers who had heard their grandparents speak of planes falling from the sky. They found wreckage, engines half buried in mud, propellers wrapped around tree trunks, human remains scattered across crash sites that had lain undisturbed for half a century. One by one, the dead began coming home. Each recovery was a small victory against oblivion. Each identification restored a name to a statistic. Each funeral, conducted with full military honors for men who had been missing for decades, reminded Americans of a sacrifice they had never known about. The recovery work continues today. Hundreds of Hump crews remain unaccounted for. The jungle has hidden them for 80 years, but the search goes on. In 2009, the remaining veterans of the Hump gathered for what they knew might be their final reunion. They were old men now, in their 80s and 90s, with white hair and weathered faces. Many came in wheelchairs, some needed oxygen. A few still had the steady hands and clear eyes of pilots, but most were simply survivors, men who had outlived the mountains, the weather, the odds, and the forgetting. They told their stories one more time. They remembered the friends who never came back. They toasted the forgotten bastards of India, and for a few hours they were remembered. The Hump was not a battle. It was not a campaign with a start date and an end date, with objectives captured and enemies defeated. It was a job. Every day for 3.5 years, young Americans climbed into cargo planes and flew into the mountains. They knew the odds. They had seen the empty bunks, walked past the personal effects waiting to be shipped home, listened to the silence that followed a crew's failure to return. They flew anyway. Not for glory. There was no glory on the Hump. Not for recognition. The newspapers wrote about other things. They flew because the cargo had to get through, because China had to stay in the war, because someone had to do it, and they were the ones who had been asked. The Forgotten Bastards of India gave more than 1,600 lives to a mission that most Americans have never heard of. They disappeared into mountains and jungles that hid their remains for generations. They died alone, in cockpits full of smoke, on ridgelines no one would visit for 50 years. Today, flying the same route takes a few hours in a pressurized airliner cruising at 40,000 feet. Passengers look out the window at the Himalayas far below, a beautiful abstraction of snow and rock, and never think about the young men who fought those peaks at 12,000 feet in unpressurized cabins with ice on the wings. But the mountains remember. The wreckage is still there, scattered across the high places, slowly rusting, slowly returning to the earth. And somewhere in America, in a cemetery or a living room or a box of old photographs, there is a record of each man who didn't come back, a name, a face, a telegram that arrived one day in 1943 or 1944 saying only that a son or a husband or a father was missing in action over a place called the Hump. They called themselves the Forgotten Bastards of India. For 80 years. They were right. Maybe it's time to remember.